Attualmente il professor Matsaganis insegna in Italia al Politecnico di Milano, però il suo percorso è stato all'estero. È greco di nascita e ha completato però i suoi studi la laurea e il dottorato in Inghilterra e ha insegnato alla London School of Economics, all'Università di Creta, all'Università di Atene, dove continua a coordinare anche una unità di ricerca su policy analysis e è stato anche per un periodo dal 1997 al 2001 presso la Presidenza del Consiglio greca. Dunque ha una serie di esperienze come advisor e consulente di organizzazioni internazionali per la Commissione Europea, per l'OECD, UNICEF, la Banca Mondiale e è stato membro del gruppo di esperti su Social Investment for Growth and Cohesion per la Commissione Europea e dal 2013 è nell'advisory board di Solidarity Now, che è un'associazione che ha sede ad Atene e che è supportata dalla Open Society Foundation. E i suoi interessi, nasce come economista, però noi lo conosciamo molto anche come studioso di public policy e ha scritto di molti temi pregnanti riguardanti le politiche pubbliche, la tassazione del lavoro, la disoccupazione giovanile, i temi anche della salute, le pensioni, il supporto al reddito, la politica sociale europea e molti altri temi. Ha pubblicato, ora non soffermo sulle pubblicazioni perché avremo bisogno di tutto il tempo insomma, di questo incontro, quindi sorvoliamo, però ha pubblicato sulle riviste più prestigiose che si occupano di questi temi e in onore anche della nostra Valeria Forgion voglio anche menzionare il fatto che è nel board anche della rivista, non solo Espanet Europa, Espanet Italia. Dico, Valeria Fargione è una delle fondatrici di questa rete e anche ha pubblicato nella rivista delle politiche sociali che si collega a questa associazione scientifica. Io non andrei oltre nella presentazione e lascerei invece la parola al professor Matsaganis. Voi sapete che lei ci parlerà della Political Economy of Austerity in Southern Europe. La lezione sarà in inglese e quindi comprensibile per i nostri ospiti Erasmus. Spero anche i nostri studenti italiani insomma, possano seguire bene. Però il professor Matsaganis parla un ottimo italiano, quindi gli ho strappato anche un po' la disponibilità dopo a fare una discussione sia con domande in inglese sia con domande in italiano, quindi potremo interagire nelle due lingue a seconda del vostro. Quindi grazie ancora e lascio la parola a tutti. Grazie.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you to the organizers and thank you for being here to listen to me. After this introduction, I can only go down. It will be an anticlimax, the rest of the presentation. But what can I do? Okay, this is a theme of my presentation, the political economy of austerity in Southern Europe, which is it's ongoing research, partly undertaken jointly by myself and Sofia Perez, who teaches political science at Boston University. We published this paper last month. So today I'm going to cover, I'm not going to present the paper, but I'm going to cover roughly the same period as the paper, which is the crisis and the austerity from approximately 2008 to 2014. The research is going on, but perhaps next year I may present the rest of it, the recovery, or what there is of it. Right, this is the structure of my presentation. I'm going to say very few things about the origins of the crisis. I'm not going to bore you too much with that. And then I'll talk about the effects of the austerity, economic, social, and political. And then I will conclude. Right. I just want to make one point that since the beginning of the European crisis, of the Eurozone crisis, that was after the Great Recession, the international financial crisis, there emerged a dominant narrative that this European crisis is really a fiscal crisis of irresponsible governments who couldn't do what they had vowed to do. In other words, make sure that they had public finances under control. Well, this is certainly true in the case of Greece, not that much in the case of other countries, especially Ireland and Spain, which actually were champions, European champions in fiscal rectitude. Remember that one of the Maastricht Treaty provisions was that debt or the debt to GDP ratio should not exceed 60%. Well, Spain and Ireland had almost half that, around 30% of GDP in the immediate period just before the crisis. So, and even in terms of fiscal deficit, they did rather well. So the explanation that the crisis erupted and countries got into trouble because of fiscal issues is not very convincing. But this is a dominant narrative among politicians. Among economists, opinion shifted. There was this famous consensus report that came out last year, and the main point was that what united the countries that got into trouble, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy to some extent, was not the fact that they had fiscal issues, but rather that they ran quite significant current account deficits. Now, current account means basically trade, the trade balance, exports minus imports, trade of goods and services. So if you look at the graphs, from the mid-1990s, and especially after the introduction of the euro, the current account of South European countries and Ireland, let's call them periphery countries, deteriorated pretty rapidly and pretty dramatically. Whereas, of course, the exact opposite happened in the north. That was not necessarily, that was not bound to happen. It might have, a different scenario might have occurred in which core countries, Germany, Netherlands, and the others remained in balance. South European countries went into deficit, and the flows of exports and imports and the corresponding capital flows involved trade with the rest of the world, China, the US, what have you. But this didn't happen because the Eurozone as a whole remained in balance in the 2000s. So everything took place within the Eurozone. South European countries and Ireland went into deficit, and Germany, Netherlands, and other core countries went into surplus. So it all happened within the EU, and of course, when you have large external account imbalances, almost by definition, you must have huge capital flows to make up for this. So that means that savers and investors in Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and other core countries lent to the periphery. So the other side of the coin of the external imbalance was a flow of capital from the north to the south and Ireland, which is important, I think, because it goes against the dominant narrative that the crisis was a crisis of fiscal irresponsibility. But of course, since Greece was the country that went into crisis before the others, and the Greek bailout in direct contravention of the no bailout clause on which the Maastricht Treaty rested, really, and the creation of the euro, since that preceded the Irish and the Portuguese bailout in 6 months later and a year later, somehow it colored people's understanding of the crisis. So the European leaders set aside the no bailout clause. They actually bailed out Greece, and at the same time bailed out French and German banks that had invested or lent to Greece. So the bailouts saved the euro, but at a rather hefty cost, and that cost fell exclusively on taxpayers in the countries that were bailed out rather than savers and investors in the north. The bailout came at a price. The price was huge austerity or fiscal consolidation and structural reforms, mainly labor market reforms, but also, in theory at least, product market reforms. That was a case explicitly in Greece and Portugal and also Ireland. As you know, Italy and Spain, the larger South European countries, were not subject to the same kind of conditionality. They were subject to rather softer forms of conditionality in the shape of pressure on the part of the European Central Bank, basically. All these confidential letters that became public the day after, almost. And of course, beyond Southern Europe, there were other bailout programs and balance of payments assistance in Eastern Europe. All right. So I was very quick about the origins of the crisis. Of course, this is a complicated, complex, rich story. I'm happy to talk about it if that's what you're interested in. But I think it's time to move to the effects of the austerity. Let's start with economic effects and the fiscal effects. Remember that the whole point of the bailout agreements was that the countries that were being bailed out owed to bring their fiscal policy under control. And this, in the narrow terms of this fiscal consolidation, the bailouts were a resounding success because very quickly, both Greece and Portugal, the two South European countries that were in explicit bailout programs, improved their fiscal position spectacularly. It was a resounding success. On the left, it's the overall budget deficit or surplus. On the right, it's what is known as the primary fiscal balance, that is the budget balance on the left minus debt servicing costs, the money governments spend to service their debt, which is partly beyond their control. In the short term, it is beyond their control. So really the fiscal effort shows better on the right. And as you can tell, both the red line, Portugal, and Greece, the blue line, went into surplus above zero in the year 2013, even though they started from a net primary fiscal deficit of 10% in the case of Greece, 8% in the case of Portugal. So that was huge, unprecedented. The OECD has written that, you know, the fact that Greece improved its fiscal balance by 5 percentage points of GDP in 1 year, 2010, was unprecedented. It had never happened before, and it went on. In terms of public debt, or rather the debt to GDP ratio, things were less rosy, basically because the GDP, the denominator, fell. So the debt to GDP ratio couldn't improve that much. So debt went up as a proportion of GDP. except in the case of Greece, which was subject to what is known in the jargon as a haircut or a reduction in the nominal value of bonds, Greek government bonds, at the hands of private investors. So private investors lost 53% of the value of their paper in a negotiated, well, they were arm twisted, but negotiated so that it was not seen as a bankruptcy, as a default. Well, fiscal consolidation was one thing. The other thing was structural reforms, and the idea behind structural reforms was that the countries that were being bailed out, since they were members of the Eurozone, could not devalue, because in another counterfactual scenario in which the euro had not existed, Greece and Portugal would have devalued their currency straight away. Well, they couldn't do that, or they didn't want to do that, because of course it's not entirely correct that there is no alternative. There is always an alternative, but most people think that the alternative is so much worse that they are willing to put up with austerity and reforms. So the idea was that countries could not devalue their currency, but in order to get out of trouble, they had to export more. So how can you export more? Perhaps by reducing the prices of your goods, of the goods produced by Greek and Portuguese firms. And how do you do that? Well, through internal devaluation, since you cannot devalue your currency. What does it mean? Well, it means that prices have to fall. And how can you do that? Well, by starting to reduce production costs, labor costs, first of all, wages. So one dimension of internal devaluation was a wage devaluation, really. Although ostensibly, in theory, there was another dimension to that, the product market reforms, let in competition to reduce prices. All right, that didn't happen that much. Labor market reform happened a lot, and there were many components to labor market reform everywhere in Southern Europe, to a varying degree in each country. But the common elements was a loosening of employment protection legislation. It was made easier for firms to fire workers. The costs of doing so were reduced. The other component was that collective bargaining was the scope of collective bargaining was reduced. Yet another component was to do with minimum wages. Italy has lacks a statutory minimum wage, but the other three countries do have a national minimum wage. In the case of Spain and Portugal, that was frozen in nominal terms. In the case of Greece, it was reduced by quite a lot. And of course, the overall direction of the labor market reforms was that the power of unions, labor unions, was curtailed, was reduced. As I said before, the counterpart to all that was product market reforms. But that didn't happen, or wasn't as successful, didn't go as far as labor market reform. Did it work? Well, not that much. Look at the two graphs. On the left, imports. On the right, exports. How can you eliminate your external account deficit? Well, by a combination of the two. Actually, in Italy, this is what happened. Imports, the green line, went down. Exports went up. In the case of Spain and Portugal, the main driver of rebalancing the external account was exports. So Portuguese firms and Spanish firms shifted from the domestic market, which didn't go that well because of austerity, to the international market, the European and international market. And actually the export performance of Portuguese and Spanish firms was better than the Eurozone average, which is the dotted line, the black line. In the case of Italy, Italian firms did less well, better than before, but less well than the European average. But it helped that imports fell. In the case of Greece, the entire job was done by a collapse of imports, and Greek exports improved very little. In fact, in the year 2014, Greek exports were below the level pre-crisis, 2008. So, given that internal devaluation went further in the case of Greece, one is entitled to question the wisdom of internal devaluation as the engine of improving the export position of firms and so on. What about the economic effects of austerity? Well, I think it is safe to it's fair to say that these had been underestimated beforehand. And this was made explicit both in the year 2010 when the IMF and the European Union said that they assumed that the fiscal multiplier would be 0.5. I will explain what the fiscal multiplier is. It's very easy. You cut your deficit by 5 euros, by 10 euros, and what are the effects on the economy? The GDP shrinks by 5 euros. So you cut your deficit by 10, half of that is lost because GDP falls, but the other half remains and presumably gives a boost to the economy. Well, it's not very good, but it's better than what actually happened, which was that as the IMF estimated after the event, the actual fiscal multiplier seen in countries like Greece and Portugal was much higher, as high as 1.7. That means that you cut your deficit by 10 euros and you see your GDP fall by 17 euros, which calls the, it's a Sisyphus story, isn't it? You try to push a rock up the mountain, but the rock falls upon you. So, this is what the IMF said in 2013, causing a bit of a brouhaha. The Olli Rehn, who was the European Commissioner for the Economy, said that the IMF study was not very helpful. But I mean, helpful or not, it was rather true to what happened. And of course, that showed. GDP growth was pretty bad throughout Southern Europe, catastrophic in the case of Greece. Greece and Spain had grown an awful lot before the crisis, perhaps in an unsustainable way. But the Greek economy collapsed after the crisis, and the Spanish economy received a blow and then recovered. And the same to some lesser extent happened in the case of Portugal. So if you take a very long, if you take a longer perspective, and if you compare the performance of South European economies to the EU average in purchasing power parity, so abstracting from differences in the cost of living, you will see that Greece and Spain improved a lot before the crisis, and then, as I said, living standards in Greece collapsed. In Spain, they fell, but then rose again. Portugal is a different story because the Portuguese economy had stagnated in the first decade of the euro, and then there was a downturn, but not as dramatic, and then some improvement. And the case of Italy is different again, because Italy, in relative terms, is in steady decline, at least since the 1990s, slow decline. The other thing I wanted to say was that, GDP fell throughout Southern Europe, And there are two components, roughly speaking, to GDP: consumption and investment. And the funny thing is, although rather expected, was that both governments and firms and households cut their consumption less than they cut their investment, which is understandable, but not very good for the future. So look at the investment situation. The graphs look similar, but if you look at the scale, it's much greater. So investment in Italy fell by 25% in 2008 to 2013, whereas consumption fell by 5%. Investment by 25%. In Spain and Portugal, around 35%. And in the case of Greece, over 60%. This is understandable because when you are in trouble, you prioritize consumption over investment. But it's also pretty bad in the longer run because the future recovery of your economy depends on investment in the recent past. So prospects cannot be that optimistic when investment had fallen by that much. All right, let's move to the social effects. One of the obvious implications of the austerity and the crisis was that employment fell throughout Southern Europe, especially in Greece and Portugal, but then in the case of Portugal, which maintained a higher employment rate throughout, the Portuguese labor market rebounds somehow. Greece has an employment rate which is lower than it was in the early 1990s, which is pretty bad. And as you can tell, in terms of employment rates, Spain and Portugal is in a worse situation now than it was before the crisis. Unemployment is even more dramatic, and you know the story. In Spain and Greece, unemployment went up to almost 25% and above, almost 30%, and then fell in Spain, not that much in Greece. In Portugal, it went up to around 18% and then fell again. The Italian story again is the trajectory is different in Italy. There is a rather steady trend upwards, but not that dramatic. But, all right, I'll say that about earnings. Many people lost their jobs, okay, and those who kept their job or moved from one job to the other experienced earnings loss, and earnings didn't recover more recently. As you can tell, in all 4 South European countries, earnings were below the European average to start with, and now they are considerably below the European average, even though wages didn't rise in Europe as a whole either. Right, so when unemployment rises and earnings fall, social spending kicks in. That's the whole idea of the welfare state as a social stabilizer. Did that happen in Europe? Well, in Europe as a whole, yes, it did, especially in the early years of the European crisis. Spending went up in Europe, the black dotted line, and kept rising at a slower pace even later. But that didn't happen that much in the countries of Southern Europe. If you look at the panel on the right, as the recession worsened, social spending went down rather than up. In both Portugal, Spain, Greece, catastrophically so, even Italy, until the year 2013. So what this graph is telling you is that even though the European welfare state worked pretty much as prescribed, in the case of Southern Europe, the welfare state as a social stabilizer didn't work, because as the crisis reduced earnings and private incomes, the austerity reduced the capacity of the welfare state to act as a social stabilizer. But that, perhaps that what I have just said is a bit simplistic, because the other side of that story was some pretty structural, pre-existing failings of the South European welfare state, the fact that it's pension heavy, and in terms of unemployment benefits is not very good, or in the case of minimum incomes, even worse, especially in Greece and Italy. Right, what happened to inequality? Well, it did rise, but not as dramatically as you might have expected. In the case of the Gini index, not that much. But the Gini is a funny animal. It's an inequality indicator, as you must be aware, that is more sensitive to changes around the middle of the income distribution. So it's necessary to complement the Gini with another indicator, and we have another indicator very handy, which is the income quintile ratio, and it looks at the proportion, the share of income earned by the richest 20% divided by the share of income earned by the poorest 20%, which is by definition an indicator which is sensitive to changes at the two ends of the income distribution, the rich and the poor. And that indicator went up, but again, not dramatically so. Spain, yes, from 0.5 to almost 7, but that's the most dramatic of all changes. The trend is upwards. Why? Well, because it's not strictly speaking true that the crisis made the poor poorer and the rich richer. It didn't. It made the rich poorer, but not that much. And of course, they started from a much better position. But this resulted in a slower rise in inequality than you might have expected if you read the newspapers, for example. What about poverty? Well, the standard indicator of relative poverty looks at the proportion of population with income below 60% of median. But of course, in a crisis, the median goes down. So you don't expect dramatic changes in poverty. And in fact, poverty did go up, but not dramatically so. So in Greece and Spain, from around 20% to around 22%, which is not dramatic. But if you look at another indicator, which is called anchored poverty, and it looks at the proportion of population with an income below 60% of median in a previous year, in this case in the year 2008, adjusted for inflation, that went up by quite a lot, from around 20% to 30% in Spain, 25% in Italy. And in the case of Greece, to almost 50%. That means that almost 50% of Greeks in the year 2014 had an income that would have qualified them as poor in the year 2008, right? By the standards of pre-crisis, they were poor. So I think you need both to have a more complete picture. But of course, people didn't just lose money. In some cases, because of the austerity and because of reforms or because of general chaos in the delivery of public services, people also lost access to healthcare in this case. And to the extent that this was the case, you can, it shows in this indicator, which asks people whether they needed medical care and they couldn't access the care that they needed because it was too expensive. They couldn't afford it. Well, in the case of Spain, the proportion of people saying that they couldn't afford necessary medical care was 0% before the crisis, much better than the European average. and it went up to 0.3%. So the Spaniards did rather well in the sense of keeping their health service accessible even to people with low incomes. In the other countries, especially Italy in this case, and Greece, the proportion of people that cannot afford medical care is higher. It was 4% before the crisis, and it went up to 10% in Greece and 6% in Italy after the crisis. And this graph is for the entire population. If you look at, I haven't shown this graph here, but if you look at the corresponding figures for those who are in the poorest 20% of the population, the proportions are higher in all countries, even in Spain, but again below 1%. In the case of Greece and Italy, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's something like 16, 17%, which is pretty bad, especially given that health policy in these countries aims at providing access to care free of charge to everybody. Well, this doesn't happen. Let's move to the final part of my presentation, or the semi-final, political effects. Well, you know the story. It doesn't simply concern Southern Europe, it concerns Brexit, UK, and Trump, US. People profess a loss of control, in some cases a sense of national humiliation, certainly in the case of bailed out countries, Greece, perhaps Portugal to some extent, rising inequalities, falling incomes. All these erode trust in institutions and open political space for outside challengers, new parties, sometimes anti-systemic parties that challenge incumbent mainstream parties in government. So this is a story also in Southern Europe, but not throughout Southern Europe, because Portugal miraculously seems to have escaped the fate of Greece or Spain, or even Italy, where both the center-left and the center-right lost ground between 2008 and 2013, and the main beneficiary, of course, was Movimento 5 Stelle, but we don't need to say that much about Italy, because in 2 weeks' time there is a general election and we'll see what happens. In Greece, again, both the Socialist Party and the Conservative Party lost ground. The Socialist Party was almost liquidated. It used to be the dominant party for 30 years in Greece, and as late as October 2009, it enjoyed the support of almost 45% of the electorate. And now where is it? It is around 5%. The Spaniards have a word, pasokificación. It means the fate of a socialist party, PASOK, in the case of Greece, going from greatness to irrelevance in the space of a few years. Who were the main beneficiaries? Well, of course, the radical left, which moved from 5% to over 35%, but also the radical left's government allies, a nationalist right party that got 6-7% of the vote, and of course the extreme neo-Nazi party, Golden Dawn, that used to get 0.2% at the elections, and now it's about 6-7% of the vote. And of course, in Spain, yet another story. Again, the Socialist Party lost, but not that much. But still, it moved from 45% to 20%, which is pretty bad. The Conservative Party lost, especially between 2011 and 2015. And we have two new parties, the anti-systemic Podemos and the not so anti-systemic Ciudadanos. Both came from nowhere. to national prominence, and at recent polls, they poll between 20 and 25%. And of course, the Spanish situation was further complicated by the Catalan crisis, which is also part of the story. Portugal, as I said, seems to have escaped that kind of turbulence, especially if you look at the October 2015 general election, in which the socialists rebounded, Valeria, to above 30%. The Conservatives lost ground. They still were the largest party, but they couldn't form a government. And what happened? Well, what happened was that Portugal is now ruled by a very successful, by all accounts, center-left government, a minority socialist government that is supported in parliament by Bloco de Esquerda, which is Syriza, the Greek radical left's sister party, and the Communist Party. Both the radical left and the communists are not part of the government, but they have agreed to support the government in parliament. Well, in Greece, the socialists and the radical left don't talk to each other, let alone contemplate that kind of alliance. And as I said, the Portuguese government is very successful. Well, Portugal is on an upswing. The new chairman of the Eurogroup, the group of Eurozone finance ministers, Centro, is the former Portuguese Minister of Finance, a socialist. The European Commission has congratulated Portugal on bringing public finances under control, even though they scrapped austerity and they raised minimum wages. So they are doing very well. During the austerity, in the previous period, trust in the EU fell throughout Southern Europe. Well, it fell throughout Europe, but the thing about Southern Europe was that before the crisis, look at November 2009, all four South European countries, in all four South European countries, trust in the EU was higher than it was in the EU as a whole. And now well, not now, in the year 2013, at the height or at the depth of the Eurozone crisis, the exact opposite happened. Trust in the EU was lower in Southern Europe than in the rest of the EU, and especially low in Greece and Spain, below 20%, from around 55% before the crisis, or even over 60%. So trust in the EU fell, but more people trusted the EU than they trusted their own government in Southern Europe. Trust in the national government in all four countries was 20% in November 2013, compared to almost 30% in the rest of the EU. I have somewhere, wait, bear with me. I have the same figures for after the worst period, here we are, of the crisis. So from November 2013 and May 2017, you will see that trust in the EU improved everywhere, in Southern Europe included. Not that much in Greece. Well, even in Greece, but it's still below what it was before the crisis, a lot lower. It has improved in Italy and Spain, but it is below the European average. And in Portugal, it's much higher than it used to be and much higher than the EU average. That's trust in the EU. What about trust in the national government? Not that high in Spain, Italy, let alone Greece. Very high in Portugal. Portugal is my favorite country in this story. Well, my co-author, Sofia Perez, who knows Portugal better than I do, says that, okay, they are doing very well, but we shouldn't be that enthusiastic. All right. But since Sofia is not around to censor me, I can be as enthusiastic as I like. Well, I'm sure things are not great in Portugal either, but they are much better than they are in the rest of Southern Europe. All right, I'm almost done. Do I have 5 minutes?
Let's see. Of course.
I mean, okay, I don't need to say that much. Just to wrap up, actually I will quote from the recent paper that we published with Sofia Perez. In the paper we covered ground that we didn't cover here. For example, what governments did faced with demands for austerity. They had to cut spending and raise taxes, but they had some leeway on how to do it, what exactly to cut, by how much, what to raise, which groups to shield, which groups not to protect that much. Well, on the whole, austerity deepened the recession, made things worse in the economy, and in a way hypothecated, undermined long-term prospects for growth by cutting investment more than consumption. Internal devaluation increased inequality and is likely to increase it even further in the future, because if you cut health and education, that's not very good for the income distribution in the longer term. All four national governments tried to varying degrees, tried to design spending cuts and tax increases in as progressive way as they could. But that didn't work very well, because even if the first order effects are progressive, say you raise taxes more on the rich than on the poor, which is pretty much what everybody did. All right. The first order effect of that is to improve the income distribution, to reduce inequality. But the second order effect is that when people have higher taxes and less disposable income, they spend less. So some firms go bankrupt and some people lose their job. And this always is bad for income distribution. It increases inequality. So you have this twin effect. The first order effect may be to reduce inequality. The second order effect is always to increase inequality. And on balance, the second effect dominates. It overwhelms the first effect. So inequality as a whole increased, even though governments did make some effort to protect poorer groups. That effort wasn't very successful, because what governments almost instinctively do is to protect the main clients of the welfare state, which is the old pensions and so on. But what happened in the years of the crisis, I have some slides, but I'm not going to show them now unless you want me to in the discussion. What happened in the crisis was that, okay, poverty rates, relative poverty rates didn't go up very much. I said that before. But underneath this picture of stability, relative stability, there was considerable change. And what happened was that even though the population in poverty didn't increase that much, the composition of that population underwent radical change. So in all four South European countries, if you look at who is the poor, you find fewer elderly and many more working age households, often with children, usually living in cities, right? So even though the number of poor didn't increase very much, the composition of that population changed dramatically. And governments were better at protecting the old than they were at protecting the unemployed and the poor. And it's understandable, because Greece and Italy didn't have a minimum income scheme until very recently. How can you protect the poor without a minimum income scheme? And how can you protect the unemployed when, in the case of Italy, Italy didn't have a proper unemployment benefit scheme? Cassa integrazione is a different thing until the Jobs Act, basically. And Greece did have an unemployment benefit scheme that covered only 10% of the unemployed. So that's another part of the story. Okay, I'll skip the political effects because I don't know very much about them, or I'm not an expert. I will sum up. This is my last slide. So one of the questions that we wanted to address was whether internal devaluation was wise. Our verdict is that it wasn't very wise in the way it was attempted. Because yes, you cannot devalue your currency. You have to do something about making your products cheaper. But this is, first of all, you make your products cheaper not just by reducing wages, but by reducing other costs that were increased, or by encouraging competition in product markets. That didn't happen that much. But if you think about it, who are South European firms competing with? They are not really competing with Chinese and Indian firms to hope that they will regain market share by making the products cheaper. They have somehow to come up with good quality products reasonably priced. And in order to do that, you need to do other things than internal devaluation. Invest in skills, for example, or even raise wages to attract better qualified workers in a second step. None of this happened, and most of this wasn't even in the radar of the Troika. It was as if the main recipe for regaining competitiveness was to reduce prices by reducing wages. That was at best short-sighted. And of course the effect, I'm not showing the graphs, but I can do so later if you like. One of the effects was brain drain, for example. Many well-qualified Spaniards, Greeks, Portuguese, Italians left their countries to find employment elsewhere. This is another obscure aspect of the Eurozone crisis. You have Germans complaining about Greeks wasting the best years of the euro by spending as if there was no tomorrow, which is partly true, but partly higher public spending before the crisis went into educating Greek doctors, for example, who now serve in German hospitals. And of course, Germany hasn't paid for their education, which is something that always makes me smile in a bitter kind of way. So, from the point of view of political economy, the main question, which is a European question, about how to create a Eurozone economic governance that works for all countries, not just core countries. This is still an open question, and my fear is that we don't talk about it enough. So a solution to that enigma does not seem very imminent. Okay, I'll stop here. Open to your questions. And